Hello, all. I'm sorry about the poor production quality of this and the limited board space, but I'm doing this, in my bedroom, in my apartment, and my phone is filming me, and it's taped to a bar stool with duct tape. So that's going to be how it is. But what I did was I went on Brightspace and uploaded all the pertinent notes from this lecture in a Word file. So at least you'll have all the notes if you miss something while I'm writing, because I'm going to have to erase a lot because the board is small. And the other thing is, I guess you can pause and rewind. I sent out an email on Friday about how we're going to run this. So I'm going to film these lectures. I'll put them, 2 lectures a week roughly, up on a YouTube channel, and I'll link to it on Brightspace, so everything will be on Brightspace. And the way that we'll take attendance is, because I'm supposed to have either attendance or some way of assessing or evaluating how engaged students are in the class. During our normal class times, where we used to have class, when it was a normal world, we're going to log into a group chat. So how the group chat will work is I'll set it up, I'll be there ahead of time, then we'll log in at our normal class time. And before I take attendance, I'll talk about the stuff that I've uploaded. I'll talk about any assignments that are due, logistical stuff like that. And then I'll quickly make sure to get a head count of who's on there as far as attendance. And then we'll have like a question and answer time, so you can ask me questions about content, like lecture content, or you can ask me questions about assignments, etc., right, during the group chat. And I'll take like one at a time, right, and answer them. And obviously you can also email me and message me at any time. All right, so this lecture is chapter 21. We're moving on to chapter 21 on gender, right? So I've broken it down like this. I'm going to talk about sex versus gender first, right? How we define them, the terminology. There's a lot more that goes with that. Then we'll briefly do gender theory, which will be like what functionalists say about it, what conflict theorists say about it, what symbolic interactionists say about it. And then we'll move on to gender stratification, or inequality. If you assume the binary between men and women, inequality between men and women in society, right? All right. Sorry, this is rough. Okay. Before I start writing notes, in sociology, when we're talking about gender, there's basically 2 major areas of discourse, right? The first is the inequality in society that exists between men and women. That's sort of the older discourse, right? And the more contemporary discourse is the discourse about gender itself, or a debate over whether gender is itself socially constraining. So gender as problematic, and in that way we're questioning the gender binary, whether we need to have this strict distinction like we do in our society between men and women, and whether we should have gender roles in our society or expectations for people based on whether they're male or female, etc. I'm going to start with the latter discourse because I'm going to be talking about what sex is and what gender is. And then later at the end, like I said, we're going to talk about the gender stratification. We'll talk about the inequality between men and women, right? All right, so let's start by differentiating between 2 really important terms, and they get conflated all the time by people, and I think that really leads to a lot of the problem with the debate that we see nowadays. So sex is going to be all the biological stuff, right? So sex is defined as the biological difference between males and females. So the biological difference between males and females. So what we're talking about here is obviously biological stuff. So genitals, chromosomes, right? Oh gosh, am I not? Here, let me shift. No, I can't get it on frame. Sorry, this is going to be a bit of a learning curve for me to try to get. I had it better earlier. All right. Okay. So, sorry. Okay, so sex is the biological difference, right? So genitals, chromosomes, hormones, right? Secondary sex characteristics, etc., right? So the biological difference between males and females, including all that biological stuff. Okay, now, this would be the more straightforward and objective side, right? As opposed to gender, which I'll talk about in a second, which is completely socially constructed, so it's a lot more complicated. But even sex is not without complications, right? When we're talking about biological sex, right? There's it's not exactly straightforward, right? So it's estimated that 1 to 2% of our population, right, is somehow intersexed, right? And this is not necessarily a term like transgender. Intersex means literally there's some combination, right, of different sex characteristics, right? So it's estimated that 1 to 2% of the population doesn't fit, right, what medicine has defined as your average male body or your average female body, right? So there are lots of infants that are born that don't clearly fit how we define one category or another medically, right? Because nature does not care about our binary, right? So infants can be born, for instance, with external female genitalia and undescended, testicles. They could be born with external male genitalia and ovaries. They could be born with androgynous genitalia, external genitalia, where doctors are not sure if it's male or female. Bear with me 1 second. My rig came loose, and I'm going to fix it. Okay, better? Sorry, I cannot promise this isn't going to be an absolute shit show at times. Okay, so 1 to 2% of the population is intersex, right? So, and this is unfortunate because what still happens, there's been a lot of pushback against this, and so changes are being made. But what still continues to happen in our society is that doctors they have these kind of bell curves as to what counts as like a normal male body, right? Or a bell curve as what counts as a normal female body, right? And there are infants born, right, that are outliers on these curves, right? And they literally have measurements for what a phallus should look like, as what a penis should look like as opposed to a clitoris and things like that. It's insane, but it's because we'll see in a minute that we put so much social and cultural importance on how our bodies are, that we care a lot about defining sex at birth, right? So infants are born who are outliers on these curves, right? And then what happens is doctors will sometimes recommend surgery, right, in order to correct ambiguous genitals, right? This is unnecessary surgery. It's not like the baby's unhealthy or something. It's surgery in order to correct ambiguous genitals. Typically, they'll construct female genitalia if there's not enough there for them to want to make a determination of male, right? But it's so important because we care a lot about sex assigned at birth, right? We place a lot of importance on sex assigned at birth. And so, again, sometimes we do corrective surgery on infants just so that we can assign a sex at birth. And that's because we place a lot of expectation on that, right? And that gets me to gender, right? So gender is sort of the expectations that we as a society place on people given the way that their bodies look when they're born. In other words, it's the expectations that we put on people because of their sex assigned at birth, right? So gender we can define as the behavior, personal traits, and social position that society, obviously we, the people making up society, right, associate, right? Society associates with being male or female, right? So that's the definition of gender. Behavior, personal trait, social position that society associates with being male or female. Right? So it's these expectations that we place on people given sex assigned at birth. Another way of putting this, or talking about this, is gender roles. So another way of talking about this is talking about gender roles, because gender, those expectations, right, constitutes what we'll call gender roles, right? So a gender role is basically society's concept, and again, that's us in society, right, for how men and women, we're assuming the binary here, are expected to behave, right, think, and look, right? So we have all these ideas regarding how people in society are expected to think, how they're expected to act, and how they're expected to look based on essentially, physical bodily features that we're born with, right? Or our sex assigned at birth. And we ascribe all these expectations to that, right? So that's what we're talking about gender. We're talking about something that's completely socially constructed, right? Because this stuff, these gender roles, are just based on the norms of society. And we know that our norms, right, are socially constructed. A lot of times they're arbitrary too. Our expectations about what kind of colors we associate with being male, or what kind of colors we associate with being female, like blue versus pink, right? That's completely socially arbitrary. And it has nothing to do with some sort of natural difference in sex. Now, those two things, right? The reason it's important to differentiate between sex and gender is because those two things can come apart, right? So a person's, sex assigned at birth might not correspond with the gender role, right, they want. In other words, a person might have a deep inclination not to conform to society's expectations, to the expectations that society puts on them because of their sex assigned at birth, because of how their body was constructed when they were born, right? And so someone's gender identity might differ from their sex assigned at birth, right? And gender identity is just a person's deeply held internal perception of their own gender, right? A person's deeply held internal perception of their own gender. And again, that's completely separate from sex assigned at birth. And so when you're talking about non-binary folks or transgender people, what that means, right? Trans, like, think of trans like to transgress, like to be opposed to, right? So transgender means, a person's, when a person's, right, gender identity or chosen, right, gender role does not conform to sex assigned at birth, right? And so if we, as a society, were a lot more lenient regarding all the expectations that we put on people because of sex assigned at birth, right? If we gave people a lot more room to choose their own roles in society and to act in such a way to affirm their own gender identities, right, we would be in a much better place. And we wouldn't even be having, I don't think, as much of the debate about the transgender movement as we are now, because we would be allowing people the freedom to choose roles and express themselves as they want, without making people feel constrained into roles based on something they have no control over, which is how their body looks when they're born, right? And this, the talking about LGBTQ or trans people, right? This is not just a sort of conceptual debate or discussion about gender, this sort of abstract thing in society, and how much sense it makes. This is a real social problem, right? Because we live in a heteronormative society, meaning heterosexuality is assumed, right, as the norm, and we live in a binary in a society which takes the gender binary for granted, right? So we just assume the gender binary, that there are only two genders, right? And this has, unfortunately, the result is inequality for LGBT people, and we can see that it's measurable, right? So LGBT adults and youths, actually youths especially, are at greater risk, right, of harassment, violence, especially employment discrimination. They have lower rates of perceived physical health. They have higher rates of certain mental illness, depression. They have much higher suicide rates, and LGBT youths have much higher rates of homelessness, right? So these are actual real-world problems, and not just a sort of debate over terms or a debate over concepts, right? The other thing we could say about our gender binary is that it's not immutable, right? It's not even a cultural universal, right? Because it's socially constructed, it's somewhat arbitrary. And other cultures, there have been other cultures that have made a lot more room for people as far as gender roles, gender expectations, and gender expression, right? So there have been, Polynesian societies with a third gender called the Fa'afafine, and that was like a gender that made space primarily for biological males who wanted to occupy a place in traditionally female labor, right? But it wasn't just like people saying, okay, these are males doing women's jobs. There is a separate and distinct gender, right, category just for those people, right? And this is true of other cultures too. There have been different Native American tribes that had third genders, what I think is kind of more contemporarily referred to as two spirits. There have been the Hijra in India. So there's a lot of different examples of cultures that have made a lot more space as far as gender expression. I'm not advocating adding more categories, but I think what we could do is we could seriously relax the expectations that we have given sex assigned at birth, right? And I think that would go a long way to correcting some of these issues of inequality that I just talked about. All right, so let's move on now. If my camera's going to hold. Yeah. All right, let's move on now to the theory stuff. We will start with functionalism. Again, remember functionalism, the idea that society is made up of a system of interrelated parts called institutions. They function together to maintain social stability, so the functionalist is obsessed with social stability. Also, functionalism peaked in popularity in the mid-20th century, and it's a relatively conservative theory, right? So, in a lot of societies, right, most societies, in fact, have had this gender binary, right? So the functionalist is going to say, okay, the gender binary is persistent, right? So it must have some sort of function in society. So again, it sounds they're sounding pretty conservative. Um, some of the arguments the functionalists make, if you go back to say pre-industrial societies, right? If I'm saying go way back, right? Into pre-industrial societies, you'll find that there was sort of what's considered like a natural division of labor, right? So if you're talking about like hunter-gatherer societies or something like that, childbirth and nursing, right, basically tethered women to the home environment, right? And so the argument goes that women then, occupied this specific part of the division of labor of the society. Now, those societies had very little division of labor, right? So it was like women doing one thing, like home labor, childcare, right, household stuff, and then men, right, because they weren't tethered to childcare in the same way, they got to go out and take care of the part of the division of labor that was outside the home. So, hunting, war, battles, things like that, right? And so that created this sort of natural division of labor, right? Now, I'll give the criticism for that in a second, but what that leads to is something that we get in the mid-20th century coming out of functionalism, coming from Parsons, right? And Parsons says, yeah, there is this sort of natural division of labor, and he comes up with what he calls complementarity theory. And that is basically the idea that men and women have different but complementary roles. Right? So this is kind of based on this idea of a sort of natural, right, division of labor between men and women, right? So this these theories pretty much suck, and we could say why. There's two reasons to criticize, two main criticisms, right, of functionalist theory regarding gender. The first is that this division of labor is not like culturally universal, and it's not necessary. Division of labor along gender lines is not necessary, right? Obviously, men can take part in childcare and household labor. Obviously, women can be out in the world having careers. That's what we do now, right? So it's not that this is some necessary thing, and we aren't hunter-gatherers anymore, and we aren't women are not as tethered to the home as they might have been even in that case. But that argument still, anthropologists, who have looked at ancient cultures and things, or prehistoric cultures even, have said there was a much more complex division of labor than just women doing household stuff and men going out and hunting and taking part in battle and stuff. So even that doesn't really ring true. So that's the first problem. The second problem is a kind of an ongoing problem with functionalism, is that it ignores inequality, right? Parsons says, men and women, he's talking in like the 1950s, he says men and women have different but complementary roles, but he's completely ignoring the inequality that exists because of those different roles, right? Men have historically and still today have greater access, right, to resources. They have, the conflict theorists would say, more power and resources in society, right? And that's because the traditional role, right, of childcare and household labor doesn't come with any of the power and resources. The power and resources are out in the world, right? And historically, out in the world has been the sphere, right, of male dominance, of the male part of the division of labor has been out in the world. And that's where all the power and resources are. So men have had access to that, and women have not had access to that if you're going by these traditional roles, right, that Parsons was propping up in the 1950s. And so he's completely ignoring the inequality inherent in those roles. And there's absolutely no reason to say, like, if you're talking about a couple, that one person has to have the role where they're, out in the world doing that kind of, aspect of the division of labor, and another person has to have all the household labor responsibility. It can be divided any number of different ways, right? So it's kind of silly. All right. Moving on to conflict theory, and I kind of already said a little bit of this. The conflict theorist is going to say that men are a dominant group in society, right? So men are the dominant group in society, right? And they exploit or suppress women in order to maintain that dominance. Or oppress or suppress women who are the subordinate group to maintain that dominance, right? Men as the dominant group, right? Suppressing and oppressing women. That's what the conflict theorist says. To put this in other words, right? Essentially, men have traditionally had, and still to this day have, greater access to power and resources, right? And use those to, again, maintain their dominant position. Maintain dominance, right? And they do that, right, by structuring society and culture in such a way as to benefit themselves, right? So they structure society in such a way so as to benefit men, right? In other words, gender roles, for instance, gender expectations, often reinforce male dominance in society, right? Male associated with aggression and domination, right? Female, traditionally at least, associated with passivity and things like that, right? So, and not to mention, as far, that's, more cultural, but not to mention, like, if you're talking societal, like, structure, you could see sort of institutional sexism in various aspects of all different kinds of institutions, right? And that leads to real problems, which I'll talk about later, like when I talk about the gender stratification, right? Inequality, it leads to things like the wage gap, the lack of, female representation in positions of power in politics and the economy, et cetera, right? So that's what it leads to. And that's what the conflict theorist is talking about. Obviously, a huge branch of conflict theory related to gender inequality is feminist theory. right? Feminism is just the idea that men and women ought to be equal in society and occupy equal roles with respect to power and resources, etc. And there are various branches of feminism, and that inspires a lot of different kinds of critical theory. All right, let's end the talk of theory with symbolic interactionism, right? All right, so remember functionalism, macro level, a conflict theory, obviously macro level, we're dealing with big groups. Symbolic interactionism, on the other hand, is micro level, right? So symbolic interactionism, comes from this idea that society, or we in society, reinforce culture and social structure every day. We recreate it every day from the bottom up by participating, right? So society and culture as like a participatory process. So in keeping with that idea, symbolic interactionists see gender as a kind of participatory thing. And in particular, a piece of gender theory sort of canon is a piece by West and Zimmerman, a paper by West and Zimmerman called Doing Gender, right? Think like it's active, it's participatory at the micro level. And what the idea is, the argument is that gender, right, is at the micro level a constant performance right? So all of us every day, right, are sort of performing gender, right? We're sort of basing how we behave on how we perceive others perceiving us, right? So all of us do this to a certain extent where, and we're doing it constantly. Like, so think of, this kind of is derivative of Goffman's, dramaturgical analysis, and he talks about, social life like being front stage. Anytime that we're interacting with people socially, right, we're sort of projecting the gender, right, that we want them to perceive or that we perceive them seeing, right? So, this can be different for different people, but, you're projecting some kind of femininity sometimes, you're projecting some kind of masculinity, right? Your typical cis male, cis meaning, right, that there's no conflict between sex assigned at birth and gender identity and gender performance and things like that. Your typical cis male will carry himself a certain way, dress a certain way, cut his hair a certain way, right, use certain verbiage, and we use these sort of clues that we're projecting to people all the time in order to pick out people based on gender, right? Again, gender is completely socially constructed because we make assumptions about gender, right, based on how people present themselves and how they look. We don't, and then, we don't see people's genitals, we don't see primary or secondary sex characteristics out in the world, right? That's the stuff we pretend to base it all on, right, is sex assigned at birth, but we don't see any of that. All we see is the gender performance, right? And we all have to, even if we're doing it subconsciously, right, and we've been doing it our whole lives since we were socialized into gender as small children, right, we do it with really little effort, but we still are doing it. It's still some effort, right, even if it comes easily to us. All right. Very briefly, before I move on to talking about the stratification, about the inequality, assuming the binary, the inequality between men and women in society, I first really briefly want to talk about socialization, right? So we did a whole chapter on socialization, chapter 5. We talked about all the various agents of socialization, right? That is all, if you could kind of remember back to the content from chapter 5, that is all very pertinent to gender, right? Because that is one of the, if you think about like the major agents of socialization, like family, the educational system, right? They are involved heavily in gender socialization, right? And it's important because it's how we come, right? Gender socialization is how we come to learn the expectations that society has for us based on sex assigned at birth, right? And it's how we come to internalize them, right? If we're going to be cis, or if we're not going to be cis, we might feel some internal conflict with this socialization. But this socialization comes from family, education, media, and it's ubiquitous and it's constant from a very young age. You got to think, we start socializing children before they even know they're being socialized, right? Like we start the process by painting nurseries blue or pink before babies are even born, right? We put the pink bow on the baby girl's head, right? That's not for her at that moment, that's for everyone else. So, because baby girls don't even have hair at that point, right? There's no point in having a bow, but the bow is to tell everyone else that this is a girl, right? So they don't make some faux pas, right? And it's so important, right? That's the first question we ask someone when they say they've had a baby, whether it's a boy or a girl. And so we start immediately with the gender socialization. And this can be problematic, right? Because traditionally, at least, and this is changing, but it's still the case, right? Males are overrepresented as far as like the protagonists of children's books, children's TV shows, right? They're all heavily male. And there are fewer female protagonists, fewer heroines in storybooks and TV shows and things like that. So the media is part of it. Obviously, the way that parents interact with boys versus girls is often different. There have been many studies that boy students, right, get more attention from teachers, like say in elementary school, than girls, and that's both negative attention and positive attention, but it's just more attention across the board, right? I think this is changing. But traditionally, we tended to put girls in more restrictive clothing that didn't allow for free play. The kind of toys that boys and girls are exposed to are completely different, right? I mean, this is also changing, but it's still the case, right? If you go to Target, right, there's no Toys R Us anymore, but if you go to Target, you'll notice like the pink aisle with all the girls' toys, and then the other aisles, right? And this could be problematic too, because a lot of the toys that are considered more male involve building and things that are good for STEM learning and things like that. So again, that's changing, and we're trying, as a society, to push girls more into STEM, and we're trying to expose, boys to more nurturing toys and girls to more constructive toys. But it has been the case for a long time that this socialization has created, right, an inequality that's even, caused people to internalize that inequality and just sort of accept it as normal, because that's what people have been socialized into. All right, so that's the socialization. That's how we sort of got to this point. What I want to talk about now is gender stratification, right? So the inequality right? Inequality, gender stratification is inequality of power, right? And resources between men and women, right? So sorry for this, I have to assume the binary, but like I said, there's also inequality between cisgender folk and transgender people in society. There's inequality because of heteronormativity, right, and heterosexism in society against LGBT people, right, and that's somewhat of a separate issue. But right now I want to talk about the inequality that we've seen and we continue to see between men and women in society, right, or gender stratification. Now, I can talk about this at the global level really briefly, and then we could talk about what it looks like still in our society in the U.S., right? All right, so we'll start with the global level. I guess the most important thing to mention as far as the gender stratification at the global level is globally we have a problem that's called the feminization of poverty, right? Now this is true in the U.S. too. Women are at greater risk of poverty and children are at greater risk of poverty than men. But it's more extreme at the global level. So at the global level, we have this feminization of poverty. I think I may have talked about this already, come to think of it, when I lectured on poverty and economic inequality, right? When I talked about global economic inequality, I talked about this. So we're probably already familiar with the feminization of poverty, but essentially this means that 70% of people in poverty at the global scale are women, right? So 70% of those in poverty at the global scale are women. But it's worse than that, unfortunately, because women also experience the effects or the impacts of poverty more sharply than men and even children. So what I mean by that is things like malnutrition, disease and morbidity, right? Women experience that more sharply. Why? Because women are doing the bulk of the child care, right? And also the bulk of care for sick and elderly relatives, etc., right? etc., right? So they take care of people more often. What women doing the bulk of the child care means in these sort of impoverished places in the world, these poor nations, is that the children, right, if there's any medicine to be had, right, the children get that first. If there's any food to be had, right, the children get that first. If there's any clean drinking water to be had, which often there's not, the children get that first, right? So women are more exposed to communicable disease, waterborne illnesses. They're more susceptible, to malnutrition, lack of health care, et cetera, et cetera. So women are not only experiencing poverty more often, but when they experience poverty, as opposed to men, for instance, they experience that poverty more harshly. All right. Not to mention the fact that if we talk about those poor nations, right, those peripheral nations, as we refer to them when we talked about global inequality, a lot of those impoverished nations are highly patriarchal, meaning a lot of those nations are places in which women do not have basic rights, right? Most importantly, they don't have basic reproductive rights. They don't, not only, I'm not even talking just access to abortion and birth control. I mean, they have no control in some cases over whether they have children or not, right? They're forced to have children that they can't afford to take care of and then take care of them, etc. So they don't have access to basic rights. They don't have employment opportunities. They don't have educational opportunities, etc., right? So that exacerbates the problem. And I think I mentioned this as well when I talked about global inequality, that a good way, right, to mitigate some of the problems of poverty in these impoverished countries is to empower women. Once you empower women, once you allow women access to employment and education, right, you improve, right, the problem of poverty. Because again, 70% of those people are women that are in poverty, right, and they're slightly over half the population. So improving poverty with respect to women by empowering them is a good way to improve poverty overall, to mitigate poverty overall in poor nations, right? But what I want to talk about now is women in the U.S., right? So things have gotten a lot better, especially since the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. Things have improved. Women joined the workforce again en masse in the 1970s. But there's still considerable inequality, right? Like I said before, women are underrepresented in positions of power, right? So political power, or in industry, right? Women are obviously a lot more likely to suffer sexual harassment, sexual violence, right? Domestic violence and abuse, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the perennial problem, right, of the wage gap. So here we're talking about the U.S., right? Or what we could refer to as the gender income gap, right? So the wage gap or the gender income gap. And what that means just is that women today, on average, earn about, I think the number now is close to 82%, earn about 82% of what men do, right? So now women earn about 82% of what men do. Let me see if I have some stats right. Right, so that's improved somewhat. It was less than 50% in the 1970s when women really got back to work. So the wage gap is very slowly closing, but it's kind of plateaued a little bit, and we're stuck sort of in the 80s, right? So women making about 82% of what men make. So why? Why is that the case? Why is there this wage gap between men and women? Why? Well, first is just old-fashioned sexism, right? This sort of old idea, right? This sort of outdated concept that men are the breadwinners for families, right? This is obviously less and less the case, right? As more women become breadwinners or people are making, women have had to work. We've needed dual earner incomes, right, in families since the 1980s. So this is obviously this idea that male as breadwinner is outdated, but it's still prevalent in society, right? So you still have some old-fashioned sexism that creates situations in which in some fields, right, or at least some comparable fields, you'll have women who are equally qualified to men making less, doing basically the same job, right? I can't think of... I think human resources was one example of a field in which you have women doing the same job as a man, making less money. Now, if it was one company, right, and it was the same exact job, and they were paying a man more and than a woman who was doing the exact same job, who was equally qualified, experienced, and stuff like that, that would be illegal, right? That's goes against various employment legislation, but the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, or whatever it's called. So it's illegal, but it still happens, and it happens in different ways, right? So that's part of it, just sexism. And sexism is also involved, right, in the fact that men often occupy higher positions in companies, right? So traditionally, some of these companies, right, or these parts of industry, these fields, have been kind of boys' clubs, right, in which men interact with each other in various environments where the women who work for the company are not, like on the golf course or something like that, through invitation, right? And that's what's called the glass sort of escalator, in which men sort of have an in with other men, and that enables them to be promoted more easily, etc. Right? And then there's like also the glass ceiling, which is just again old-fashioned sexism, where they'll only allow women to get to a certain point, as far as the hierarchy of power within whatever industry, company, whatever you call it. Right? So that's one of the reasons why we have a gender gap. But there's a lot more to it than just sexism, right? There's also what's called occupational segregation. And that means that women and men tend to go into different career fields or different occupations, right? And a lot of that, at least historically speaking, is down to socialization, for one, right? Like I already mentioned, women being socialized or encouraged to go into certain fields and discouraged from going into fields, and sexism, right? Where women are, kind of pushed out of certain fields, or like I said, overtly discouraged from going into certain career fields, right? So you have sort of occupational segregation from that. Same thing is true of men, right? Men are socialized to go into certain career fields, and discouraged. Traditionally men have been discouraged from going into nursing, even though that's a really, right now it's a dangerous career, but it's a really good career, right? So a lot of the wage gap can be explained by this occupational segregation, because women, let me use this. Women more often go into lower paying service jobs, right? So lower paying service fields, right? And men go into higher paying, say, tech jobs and things like that, right? Or finance jobs, etc., right? So occupational segregation accounts for a lot of that gap. Now, sometimes an entire occupation can be devalued because women go into it, right? Sort of and populate that career field, and it becomes devalued because economically speaking, because of sexism, industry leaders know that women can be paid less. So that happened, I think, back in the 1960s as an example of it. Data input, right? Remember when computers were like the size of rooms and stuff? Data entry, as far as computing, was considered a tech job, and it was really high paying. But then, the businesses realized that women who had been to secretarial school and were really fast typers were much better at data entry than the men. And so the career of data entry became populated by women, and the pay rates plummeted because at the time they knew they could pay women less. And so the entire career field was devalued. But anyway, occupational segregation is a big part of the puzzle as far as the ongoing wage gap. Finally, the last thing to mention is that women still do the bulk of household labor, right? And this is changing, but still every time that we send out surveys, right, like the GSS, the General Social Survey, we find that respondents say that women are doing most of the household labor. And that includes, right, importantly, child care, and elder care or care of sick relatives, right? That's really time consuming. And women are doing all this on top of now working full time, and they have been for decades, right? So I think the idea of the second shift right, goes back to the 1970s. It means women are working full time, they get home, and then they have to do all the household labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the childcare, the helping the kids with homework, right, the taking care of elderly relatives, etc., etc., right? In fact, when we talk about I think we're going to cover the chapter, maybe we won't cover that chapter, I can't remember. Anyway, the typical caregiver for an elderly person who needs care at home, right, is a middle-aged woman who's working full-time, right? Whether she's caring for her own parents, right, or caring for her in-laws or whatever. That's the sort of, statistically speaking, typical caregiver. So women are doing all that work. What does that mean? What it means is that women are not as present, right, to be focused on their careers because they're doing all this other stuff, right? So men have more time to focus specifically on careers, right? Which mean, and the pursuit of their careers, which means men are have more time to focus on pursuing promotions and raises and things like that. Women have less time to focus on pursuing promotions and raises and things like that, and also sometimes women even take more flexible service sector jobs, because they know they're going to need that flexibility to do all that household labor, childcare, all those kinds of responsibilities, right? So that's, I think, hopefully changing too, and we'll see a more egalitarian split of household labor increasingly happening, right? The last thing I could say about the wage gap is that men, right, have a stake in correcting this gap, right? It's not like, especially when you're talking about families, right? Men have an interest in how much, their wives or girlfriends make, right? Because household bills are split. So I think, hopefully, we'll see this wage gap continue to decrease because men also have a stake in it. And hopefully, as we sort of move away from old-fashioned sexism, we'll find that women, occupy more positions of power within, politics and the economy. All right. I'm sorry this was awful and the phone fell and all that. I'll try to correct it. I'll try to correct the angle too. I keep feeling like I have to stand up here to be in camera. I will try to fix some of the problems before the next lecture, which I will put up Wednesday, right? And don't forget to go on the group chats and check in with me every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Well, actually, this will go out to 2 separate classes. So if you're in the Monday, Wednesday, Friday, check in during your hours. If you're in my sociology, 10:10 Tuesday, Thursday class, go in your normal hours to the group chat on Brightspace, and I'll see you there.